Hello, it's Mr. Grant, and now that my camera's on, you can see me. And just so you know what we're talking about, let's just get a quick glimpse of that image that you've seen once before in class, and it was in our slideshow. And this is part of Benjamin Franklin's propaganda to have the Stamp Act repealed. Okay, just a really brief review for you here. You can see that we have some of the pattern of protest, and this is some of the responses that the American colonists had when England attempted to tax them. Many of these things were completed with the Sugar Act and then also with the Stamp Act. So you can see the first one is always to complain. Not much gets done with the complaints. These are basically verbal or printed complaints. The second step is to protest, and this can be done in nonviolent form. It can be done in violent form. You can have demonstrations included in here. And then we have pamphlets or any other form of written protest. Ben Franklin's newspaper is an example. Speeches printed and distributed are examples of written protest. And then we've discussed the petition. This is the formal written protest to those in authority, asking for change, identifying the problem and asking the change. And then in class yesterday, Monday, we read about a boycott. And the boycott was in the Stamp Act Crisis article, and we went over that. So the final step in the pattern is the repeal, and that is achieving what the colonists really want out of the whole situation. So if we go to see which way to hold this thing here, not that way, this one. All right. So if we look at the boycott scenario here, we've got our boycott. We've got our 13 colonies here in America, and they're boycotting Parliament. Parliament says, yeah, okay, you want to boycott? Go ahead. We don't make anything, we don't sell anything, so boycott doesn't hurt us. You can still have your tax. Okay, so that didn't quite work the way the colonists wanted it. So the colonists actually don't boycott Parliament. The colonists are boycotting English businesses. And the examples of the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty providing things that the colonists needed made by hand to replace these English products. So the colonists are going to boycott English products, and it's going to hurt their business. They're going to lose money. So the English businessmen are thinking, wow, who can we complain to about this? We have no money and no jobs. And ultimately, it boils down to the English businessmen complain to their government, Parliament, the people that are supposed to represent them. So they bring their issue to Parliament and say, hey, because of your tax, those Americans aren't buying our products and it hurts our business. And so we're here to put a little pressure on you to change your policy. If you get rid of the Stamp Act, the colonists will start buying our products again and we'll be happy. And so that's how a boycott works. The end result is achieved by the pressure from the English businessmen. They're the ones that are hurt from the boycott. And that pressure on the government gets the change. Okay, now one of the documents you have in your Google Classroom is this digital history document titled The Stamp Act and Methods of Protest. And in class, we've talked about a few of these methods of protest, but today we're going to take a close look at the Virginia resolutions and the Stamp Act Congress, because these are kind of special ways the colonists protested. And it really is at the center of the argument that the colonists had with England. So to back up a little bit, I'm going to read this first part from the Stamp Act and Methods of Protest for you. Despite the many arguments made against it, the Stamp Act was passed and scheduled to be enforced on November 1st, 1765. The colonists found ever more vigorous and violent ways to protest the act. In Virginia, a tall backwoods lawyer, Patrick Henry, made a fiery speech and pushed 5 resolutions through the Virginia Assembly. We're going to find out what Patrick Henry said in his speech soon. In Boston, an angry mob inspired by Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty destroyed property belonging to a man rumored to be a stamp agent and to Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. In New York, delegates from 9 colonies, sitting as the Stamp Act Congress, petitioned the King and Parliament for repeal. Okay, we'll also look at the importance of the Stamp Act Congress. In Philadelphia, New York, and other seaport towns, merchants pledged not to buy or sell British goods until the hated Stamp Act tax was repealed. This storm of resistance and protest eventually had the desired effect. Stamp agents hastily resigned their commissions, and not a single stamp was ever sold in the colonies. Meanwhile, British merchants petitioned Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. In 1766, the law was repealed, but replaced with the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had the right to make laws binding on the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The methods used to protest the Stamp Act raised issues concerning the use of illegal and violent protests, which are considered in this chapter. Okay, now, once the Stamp Act is repealed, all right, there seems to have been some confusion between the colonists in England on who's in charge and how you can get the right to tax. Okay, England says, we're in charge. We can do what we want. And the colonists are saying, well, we need to have a representative in government. So until we have a representative in government, you can't tax us. And that was over the sugar tax and the Stamp Act. Now England comes back with a new law, and it clearly states, we are in charge of making laws in the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So England is asserting its authority at this point. So let's backtrack to the Virginia Resolution from Patrick Henry and the Stamp Act Congress, and we're going to take a look at the argument of the colonists. So as I scroll down the document, you should be reading the Patrick Henry and Virginia Resolutions paragraph, and we'll get to his key points right here. And point 1 from Patrick Henry is very straightforward. Okay, in this first point Patrick Henry makes, number 1, he says the colonists have the rights of Englishmen. We came from England, our parents came from England, we were born, and we have been promised the rights of Englishmen. Number 2, Patrick Henry says we have 2 royal charters. Count them, 2. Those are signed by the king. The king says the colonists are English and they have rights. You can see he's very logical. He's a lawyer. So he's establishing the groundwork for an argument here. We are Englishmen. The king says we're Englishmen. 2 times he says it. In number 3, Patrick Henry says taxation of the colonies is done by the colonies or their representative. Taxation of the colonies is done by the local governments. It's that no taxation without representation clause he's stating. Okay, in number 4, Patrick Henry is basically restating number 3, saying, remember, you can't tax us unless we do it ourselves with our local governments, and it has never been changed. It has always been recognized by the kings and the people of Great Britain. So you can't really change that. We've always done it this way. That's how it's supposed to be done. And then the final one, number 5, is that it's a summary of sorts where Patrick Henry says only the colonists can tax the colonists. England can ask us to do it, but only our assemblies can enforce the tax. So here you have the colonists in Virginia, Patrick Henry writing this logical explanation on why the colonists are resisting the tax, and he's using historic examples. We've always done it this way. It's never been changed. The king has approved it. And so at this point, Virginia is stating their argument. Of course, England will return with the Declaratory Act, basically saying, yeah, we don't care what happened in the past, but now we're in charge in all cases whatsoever. Okay, as I scroll through the document, you're going to read this later, but you can see there's riots in Massachusetts, violent demonstrations, and then we have the Stamp Act Congress in October. Now, the colonies sent delegates or representatives to this meeting in New York City for the purpose of protesting the Stamp Act. These are the people that are going to send a formal petition to Parliament to get rid of the Stamp Act. Now, the things they come up with are 14 points that support getting rid of the Stamp Act. We've got it boiled down to 4 of the key things here. And the first thing here is that the colonies, the Stamp Act Congress, are saying, oh, we are your people, King. We owe you allegiance, and we are subordinate, or we obey Parliament. So they're kind of like kissing up to them. They're saying, okay, we're your people, and we're going to follow the rules because you're so nice and in charge. And then they get right into the key point that Patrick Henry identified. It is the right of Englishmen. This is in the English Constitution. It is the right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed upon them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. And this is where the colonists say, we are not represented and you can't tax us. Again, no taxation without representation. And then the final 2 points, the people of these colonies cannot be represented in the House of Commons in Great Britain. We're 4,000 miles away. We don't have a representative there. And then finally, it is the duty of these colonies to try to obtain the repeal of the Stamp Act. And that is what they're asking in their petition. So those are the key points of the Virginia Stamp Act resolution and the Stamp Act Congress. Now, what makes this even more important is the fact that the colonists got together in New York. And it might bring this back to mind, if you recall, from the French and Indian War. And this little piece of propaganda from Benjamin Franklin and his Albany Plan of Union, that idea that has been sleeping for 20 years, it's now coming back. And if you think about that, England now starts to think, hey, we need to watch those colonists a little more closely. Okay, there's one question for you to answer from the resources here. And it's in a separate Google Doc, but it's also on this digital history materials here. And so we're working on this activity on deciding whether an action is justified. So we're going to answer question 3. Using the criteria given above, ends, alternatives, means, and effects decide whether the use of violence in Boston was justified. So you have to go back and read about the events that occurred in Massachusetts right here. And if you review part one, right here, part one, in deciding whether it was justified, it walks you through this activity. So I want you to think about these questions and then apply them to number 3. And that would be your assignment. So you're going to be working on that for the remainder of class today. And you'll have time Wednesday as well, since we have virtual learning, and that is assigned for you to work on that day. All right, so hopefully you understand the Virginia Stamp Act resolution. You know why the Stamp Act Congress was important, and both of those statements on the colonial protest bring that idea of no taxation without representation to the forefront of the colonial argument.